Hey fearsome friends. Now I've only ever used Uber once in my life, and luckily it was a very pleasant experience. But the people in the stories I'm about to read for you were not at all. So sit back, relax, and get cozy, comfy, warm, because it's time to let your nightmares in. I was around 15 or 16 years old when this happened. I'm currently 18, and my mum, dad and I were on a family trip to New York City. We were having a great time at first. We visited the Statue of Liberty, Madison Square Garden and Times Square, etc. And for the most part it was just a normal vacation. However, towards the end of our trip, everything went wrong. It was our last day there and we were getting ready to make our way to the airport, and we decided to get an Uber. A couple of minutes passed, and a grey Civic pulled up to the sidewalk we were waiting on. I remember noticing that he had Lyft and Uber stickers on his car in multiple places, almost excessively. It kind of felt like he was trying to prove that he was our Uber. And I know it was just a small thing, but looking back, I really wish I'd been more concerned about how sus this guy actually was. So moving on, we were running late, and I'm guessing my dad hadn't really paid attention to the license plate, because this guy was definitely not an Uber driver. He was a lanky African-American man wearing clothes akin to rags and looked like he was drugged up. But at the time, nothing seemed off to us, as again we were running late, and what happened was the least of our expectations. The ride was uneventful. That is, until we got to the airport. We all expected him to get off the highway and drop us off, but he didn't. Instead, he casually continued down the highway. This was when my dad finally noticed that the man didn't have a meter or his phone set up with the Uber GPS open. So now we were beginning to get worried. My dad asked him then, in a stern voice, "Excuse me, where's your meter?" The man stayed silent, and flustered he asked once more, this time yelling, "Where is your meter?" But again there was no reply. At this point, the man started speeding down the highway, weaving in and out of other cars dangerously, and of course we were all now panicking. My dad was screaming at him to let us out, and my mother was crying and praying with her rosary clutched firmly in her fist, completely in shock. I froze and couldn't even cry or scream, as much as I desperately wanted to. I was completely immobilized. This continued for a while as we drove down an unfamiliar road to God knows where, with the car only getting faster and faster. I started having those classic end-of-the-road type thoughts like, this might be it, and there's nothing I can do about it. But luckily we were saved. I don't know if we'd passed by it or if someone in a car we had passed had called them, but we soon heard sirens blaring behind us, so we were thankfully being tailed at high speed by multiple police cars. One of the cops had a megaphone or something to amplify their voice and screamed out for the man to pull over. Obviously he put up a fight, and the police had to actually cut him off for him to finally stop. Then they helped us out of the car and got all our luggage from the trunk, whilst putting blankets around us and telling us that we were safe. At that moment I felt the biggest wave of relief wash over me, one I've never felt before in my life. Don't get me wrong, it still really messes my family and I up a lot, and I'm still pretty traumatized by the whole thing. But I was at least glad that my family and I were alive and safe. The police gave us a ride to the airport, and everything went as planned from that point on. But holy crap, am I glad that I never had to find out where this guy was taking us and what he was planning to do. Just thinking about it still gives me goosebumps. I guess the moral of the story is, always check the license plate before getting into an Uber or Lyft service. That feature on the app tells you what it is for good reason. A few weeks ago, me, a 23-year-old female, and my friend also a female and 24, planned to go to an event together. So after we'd finished work, we decided to get an Uber so it wouldn't take too long to arrive and could enjoy it more. The first half of the ride was fine and seemed as normal as it could get. He was a polite dude, but as soon as we got to the highway, his attitude completely changed and he seemed a lot more irritable. My friend and I didn't pay much attention to it though, and just kept chatting between us, when our attention was drawn when he started shouting at another driver. He turned to us and said he was going to have to pull over, and I tried objecting to this, but he ignored me and pulled over anyway. He then reached out to the glove compartment and pulled out a gun, which are totally illegal in my country, and we were just watching this unfold with utter disbelief and held our breath. When the other guy drove away, we let out a sigh of relief, but we were still stuck in a car with a crazy man who had a gun. After that, he went back to driving us to our destination and apologized to us, saying that the guy had been tailgating him. I let out a, "Oh, got it," and he continued, "That guy is lucky that you two girls are here, or else I would have followed him and shot him in the face. Sleazy idiot." I looked over to my friend and she was in shock and paralyzed with fear. I was in shock too, but trying to keep my cool because the last thing I wanted was for him to be annoyed with us. If he was willing to shoot that guy for tailgating, I didn't want to find out what he would do to us if I'd said the wrong thing. "No, it's okay, I understand," I said, trying to appease him. "These guys need to be taught a lesson," he continued, whilst I just agreed by nodding. "I did that before, you know. You just trap the guy in an empty street, and when he leaves the car, bang." Did he just admit to murder? I thought. But I managed to keep calm and just agreed with him for the rest of the journey. He did drop us in the right place with no more incident, and I decided to wait a few weeks before reporting it, as he'd had my home address, so it wouldn't have been hard to figure out who had reported him. Nobody showed up at my house with a gun, thank goodness, at least not until now, and Uber has answered my report saying that they've started an investigation. I hope this guy doesn't do this to anyone else. So this all happened a few months ago on my friend's birthday. We'd had a few drinks and the night went well, but my friend was completely wasted, so some of his friends took him home and I ordered a lift to pick me up outside. A car stopped right in front of me and the driver asked me what I was doing. Being a little over tipsy, I said I was waiting for my ride. He proceeded to tell me that he was an Uber driver and his client had just cancelled, so he'd take me right away. Right then I started to feel uneasy, but I said it was fine and that I'd wait for the one I'd ordered. He then demanded I cancel my ride and get in his car, but I'm not dumb. I didn't cancel it, but I did show him that the nearest Uber was 8 minutes away, and he was outright lying to me about who he was. For some reason then he showed me Google Maps, as if it would prove something, but if anything it made me even more suspicious. He was being really persistent, but luckily there was a cop car behind him, so he left, and I was relieved for a second. But then 2 minutes later he came back, just as my ride was turning up, so I told him this, and that it was cheaper anyway, so I wouldn't be going with him, but he said he would take me for €8 cash, which doing is against Uber policy, so I was pretty sure he had ill intentions. At that point I just freaked out and thought he could just snatch me at any time, as he then moved his upper body closer to me, as if trying to pull me in. I was going to fight back, but I wasn't really prepared to. Just then a group of people I recognized asked me if I was okay, and if he was bothering me. So right there I explained everything to them, and they yelled at him. I didn't do anything to her, he said, and they argued some more before he finally left. They stayed with me until my ride arrived, even checked the plate number, etc. But needless to say, I was pretty shocked, and thankful I hadn't been more drunk. Also thankful they'd saved me from that situation, because I don't know where I could have ended up. I don't know what he wanted. I don't know if he'd ever done something like that in the past to some other drunk girls, or if he still tries to do it to this day. I'd like to start my story by saying that I was a little high at the time of this event. I had smoked with my boyfriend 2 to 3 hours beforehand, so it had worn off really. But that out of the way, here goes. I was at my boyfriend's house after a night of cooking and watching movies. I wasn't able to stay there the night because I had a matter to attend to the next day, so my boyfriend would drop me off at home as he usually would. But like I said, we'd had a smoke, so I preferred that he stay home and I order an Uber. It was a bit after midnight, so quite late, and of course he didn't like this idea, but it was usually safe to drive an Uber back home, so I brushed off his concerns. The time came for me to leave, and my boyfriend walked me to the Uber's door to say goodbye and take a good look at the driver and number plate. Then off I went. The drive to my house from my boyfriend's takes about 15 to 17 minutes, when he suddenly started talking to me about gas prices and whatnot, and asking if that was my boyfriend before. I said yes, but mind you, it was quite obvious, and he just started giving me weird vibes, asking how old I was, if I drive a car, and what car, etc., etc. At some point we were passing through quite a desolate and somewhat long road. I live in a part of the city that is pretty covered by trees and nature, and we came across a car stopped on the side of the road that seemed to be having some trouble. The driver then asked me, "Hey, if our car was to suddenly break down in the middle of the road, what would you do?" "Let my parents know exactly where I am so they can come get me," I replied. "Smart," he said, and continued. "Now what if we'd broken down and you had no battery on your phone?" "That wouldn't happen. I always have battery on my phone." But he carried on, with different scenarios surrounding the same situation. It felt really weird and creepy, and my heart was beating so fast when he suddenly stopped asking. I was of course letting my boyfriend know everything that was going on, giving him a live location, etc. Once we were very close to our destination, which again was an even more desolate and dark area, he started talking about how dark and far from everywhere this was, and how he had never been here before. I don't know. It was all just so weird I didn't even want him to drop me off at my house, so he wouldn't know where I lived. When we arrived, I just said a quick goodbye and sped walked to my front door, locking it as soon as I got in. I don't know if I was just paranoid, or if this guy was really off, but it felt weird, and next time I will definitely be staying at my boyfriend's. Now this next story contains violent sexual abuse, so listeners' discretion is advised. So I just moved to a new city to start my first job out of college, and I didn't know anyone. Public transportation was pretty terrible where I lived, so Uber and Lyft were the only ways to travel, since I was on medication and not supposed to drive. I thought of finalizing one driver to cut out the middleman and pay them in cash, and I had a good conversation with one of the drivers who drove me home from work one day. So we exchanged numbers to coordinate upcoming trips. He cancelled my ride through Uber and dropped me home for free as a goodwill gesture, as I would be helping him out so much financially, and this happened on a Friday evening. I had the next couple of days off, so I didn't bother contacting him until Sunday evening, but he replied that he'd had a family emergency and had moved out of town for a few weeks to help out, which was about 80 miles away. I realised that it didn't make sense to have him drive an hour and a half each way to handle my pickups and drop-offs, when my office was just 4 miles from my apartment. so I wished his family well and decided to continue my commute the way I had been doing before. A couple of days later, the same driver reached out to me, thanking me for not being angry that he'd cancelled at such short notice, and I inquired about his family, just politely, and he inquired about my work. This led to a bit of back and forth, informal and platonic texting, and he was also an international like me, and was attending nursing school part-time. We had some good, friendly conversations, intermittently over the next week or so, and I thought nothing of it. When one day he asked me if I was single. I told him I'd just gotten out of a relationship due to my recent move, and he asked no follow-up questions. Then a few days later he texted me, saying he was in town to pick up some of his belongings, as he had had to leave so abruptly, and since I was working from home that day, I told him I didn't need him for my commute. He said that he would like to maybe go see a movie after work, but would understand if I didn't want to. Now, I hardly knew anyone at work or otherwise, as I'd not even been there a month, so I was eager to get to know someone from my new state. He had been so considerate so far, and we did have quite a bit in common, so I agreed. He asked me for my address, as he had cancelled that first Uber ride, so I shared it with him. He came by at a fixed time and I was ready to go, when he said to me, "I just have one request before we leave." I asked him what it was, and he told me he wanted to touch my breast. I thought he was joking and sort of dismissed it, but as I started to leave, he blocked my way and started begging and pleading. He was a lot taller and stronger than me, and I was completely frozen, so I reluctantly found myself agreeing. He asked me to lie down on the floor, and I did. Then he lay down next to me and squeezed both my breasts. He thanked me for letting him touch me, and said he hadn't been with a woman in over 6 months. He asked me when my last time had been, but I was still completely frozen and was trying to process what was going on, so I didn't respond. He then proceeded to unzip my pants, put his fingers inside me and said, "You're not as innocent as you pretend to be." I started crying and begging him not to do anything else, but he slapped me on my face, asking me to be quiet, then began to stroke my head and apologize, telling me he didn't want to hurt me. He then got up and turned off the lights. I got up too, but he asked me to lie back down. I refused this time. He told me again that he didn't want to hurt me and started pushing me, and I tried to resist, but he was too strong. He pinned me against a wall, undressed me completely, and began kissing me. The next few minutes must have passed quickly, but in my mind it took forever. Somehow I don't remember all of it, but I remember being pushed back down, stumbling on my own clothes in the darkness, him undressing himself and entering me. At one point I remember him biting me hard on my breast, and I let out a scream, but he covered my mouth and kept biting on the wound that he'd already created. I had no courage or strength left, and I was too tired and in a lot of pain, so I let him finish without any further resistance from me and left the room. I shut down, waking up the next morning having received a text asking if I wanted to meet again and thanking me profusely for the previous night. I refused and shamed him for violating my boundaries, but he asked again, this time saying that I was his girlfriend and that he loved me and that's why he wanted to touch me. He also said he thought I wouldn't mind because he had always met girls of the same nationality who seemed shy at first but liked wild action later. I told him to never visit or contact me again, so he apologized for misreading the situation and wished me the best. I had no bleeding, but some black and blue bruises on my chin, on both my upper arms, neck, and my breast. That disappeared in about a week. Needless to say, I worked remotely until I'd come off my medications and never rode an Uber or Lyft unaccompanied again. Hey, thanks for listening. I hope you enjoyed my video. And if you did, could you please give me virtual hugs by subscribing and clicking that notifications button. I also have a Patreon page and YouTube channel membership if you'd like to support me further. Thank you again for being here. Keep being creepy.